Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. There are a lot of voice modalities in that one.
Yeah, that's nice.
I don't know. Maybe I'm just feeling wild today. Well, we released a poll today, and people who listen to the podcast now know what that means. We've got the Texas Politics Project poll team in the house today to talk about some of the results. I'm happy to be joined by my friends and colleagues, Daron Shaw, professor of government and the Frank C. Irwin Chair of Local Government at the University of Texas at Austin. Daron, how are we today?
We're doing well. Good morning, Professor Henson. Dr. Blank.
Happy to hear you. Have you here today? Even if it sounds like we want to go into it. You've had a little bit of a rough week. We're here to.
That's its own podcast.
As my wife would say, we're here to rock you like a baby. Okay.
I need it.
And yes, you do. And Dr. Joshua Blank, research director of the Texas Politics Project. Josh, you've been out running around doing some child responsibilities this morning, but here you are.
I'm happy to be here as well. Happy to rock some more babies.
As is usually the case when we're fortunate enough to have Daron with us, let's start with some of the national numbers in the poll. Just jump right into it, particularly Donald Trump's standing in Texas, a state he won very comfortably. So, Josh, let's start with you. First, give us the overall, 411, which nobody knows what that means anymore, I guess. Right. The overall disclosure on the poll sample and all that, and then, lead us through some of the key Trump numbers.
Yeah, sure. So as usual, this was a poll of 1,200 registered voters in Texas. We collect the data using YouGov over the internet. That doesn't mean we randomly allow people to do this. It's actually a sample that is created to match gender, race, age, and education levels of the Texas registered voter population. Survey was conducted from February 14th to the 24th, and if you want to read more, it is all available on our website in pretty solid detail. So where are we now? Well, Trump is entering the office in a pretty high place in Texas. He had 52% approval and 38% disapproval in this survey. 53% had a favorable opinion of Trump in February. 41% had an unfavorable opinion. These were all highs in the time series, including 92% approval among Republican and only 4% disapproval. Just for a point of context, he entered in February of 2017 polling with 46% approving, 44% approving, 81-10 among Republicans. So he was at 46, he's at 53 entering his second, or 52 entering his second term, 6-point bump among Republicans, about an 11-point bump. So it's a pretty good place to start, especially when you think about the fact that most people kind of limp into their second terms. This is a little bit different, obviously.
Well, he had a break.
It's true. It's a nice break.
It's a reset.
No limping here. He had a nice break.
Right.
So, Daron, what do you've obviously been doing a lot of national polling in the last few weeks, but what do you make of what's going on here, and how does it align with what you're seeing nationally?
It's very consistent with what we've seen nationally, displaced upwards a bit because Texas is a little more Republican, a little more conservative than the nation as a whole is. I like to go back to compare where Trump was. I believe the first poll we did in his first term, where we asked approval, was June 2017. And at that point, he was 43 approved, 51 disapproved, so -8. And he's now plus 14. Now, that was 6 months in, or roughly four or 5 months in to his first administration. But as you guys mentioned, you're not supposed to gain support as you head into your second term. You're supposed to have alienated constituencies and made people, disappointed people with, uneven performance across some range of issues. So I think what's even more surprising is, given that we think opinions on Trump are so fixed, that this isn't spectacular. And this is not George W. Bush after 9/11 territory, but...
Or Willie Nelson. Certainly not Willie Nelson.
Or Matthew McConaughey.
Yeah, no.
But by Trump standards, he's as high as he has been.
Well, that's the thing about politics, right? I mean, you look at these numbers, and one of the things that's sort of, I think, doing this for so long, you're like, man, he's doing really well. It's like, where is he at? 55.
Yeah.
Right? But that's sort of the nature of these things. Is if you're sitting there above 50, really almost even in a state as Republican as Texas is, that's pretty good. I mean, you're doing pretty well here, right?
And the underlying dynamics are, and I think we commented on this spring of last year, Trump has absolutely locked down Republicans.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And that's, it's possible that he will lose them given circumstances. I remember thinking that George W. Bush would never go below 40%, that his base was so tight. And then after Katrina, he cratered. He went into the low 30s, I think, on approval. So anything can happen, of course, as we know in
and
politics.
his Republican numbers are, they got nowhere to go but down. I mean, 92% approval among Republicans right now.
Because when I saw
unbelievable.
When I see these top line numbers, and Josh can probably have the same reaction, my thought was, whoa, he must be killing it with independents and some Democrats.
Those haven't moved much.
No, he's okay.
Yeah.
But his support amongst the Republican base is considerable, and there is sort of an issue basis for that, which we can talk about as we get into the poll.
I was going to say, I was going to ask you a question, actually. I was wondering, outside the issue basis, I also wondered, as you joked before, he took a break, but also he's not being compared to his first term. He's being compared to the last guy.
Yeah.
And so I wonder, how much did that also play into this in some ways? Because, for Republicans, and you see this all over the poll, it's morning in America, right? Like, everything's going to be great now, at least on some levels, and there's some limitations to that. But I wonder to what extent, this is pro-Trump and how much of this is sort of relief that Biden is gone.
Yeah, I think the number that really stuck out to me in these overtly political numbers was the rating of the Democratic Party.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if we want to
go
save
ahead.
that for an entree. But, we ask basically, was it fave, unfave?
Yeah,
or was
it's
it
a fave,
approve?
unfave on
a
the
fave,
parties.
unfave on the parties. And let me sort of make sure I'm referencing the right numbers here. You can go to our website to check this stuff out. But I want to say the Democrats were something like minus 20.
They were the worst that they have been really almost in the whole history of measuring favorability towards the Democratic Party.
So for the Republicans, the number was plus 5. It was mid-single digits in terms of.
But they were also on a
favorability.
high.
Right.
Just
exactly. Well, ratings of the Republican Party have been at best, at sea level.
Right.
But more often than not, they're what we call underwater, more unfavorable than favorable. Republicans are now above water.
Plus 5.
Plus 5. And the Democrats are close to minus 20, I believe.
It's pretty far down. I got right here.
Yeah.
Democrats, are minus 22.
Minus 22.
Which is atrocious.
That's stunning.
It's atrocious.
Even in a
is
Republican
stunning
state,
number.
that's pretty bad.
And, Republicans tend not to view Democrats very favorably. But what this shows, the internals, are that Democrats aren't all that happy with their own party right now. They're not.
Well, I don't want to drag us. I don't want to drag us down to a rabbit hole. But we're recording Wednesday afternoon, even though I said today because we're going to release on Thursday to coincide with the release of the polling data. But this conversation you guys are having, that as we look at these numbers about Trump's position and compared to just how negative views are of the Democrats and how hobbled the Democrats are right now, and the contrast issue all on display in what I saw of Trump's speech last night and what I've read about it. I only saw about half of it. But, Democrats in disarray, sort of reduced to handheld signs and waving their canes and getting kicked out of the chamber.
And Texas
and Trump just being,
and Texas Democrats have been on full display throughout this process. And again, we're armchair Monday morning quarterbacks or armchair analysts on this. But I agree with you, Jim. The optics of it. What do you think? I mean, Trump's ability to filibuster. He's surpassing Clinton now in terms of the length of these speeches. But he's on the offense, and the stuff he's doing, people are rooting him on. The attacking, bureaucracies, going, Doge and these sorts of things play very well with the Republicans. They play well with some Democrats, and when you don't have a president, when you don't have an heir to the throne, which the Democrats don't at this point, you're kind of left open to whoever wants to volunteer themselves as the spokesperson for the party becomes the spokesperson for the party. I'm not sure Al Green waving a cane is necessarily what the Democrats would devise if they had a bunch
No,
of
in fact,
focus
the
groups.
coverage have made it clear that Hakeem Jeffries had really practically begged his members not to do what many of them
And
did.
Pelosi had said, we had to call, and she was the one who ripped his State of the Union speech in half and then quartered it a few years back, had said, times call for a more tempered response. And by the way, the strategy is clear, which is let him stew in his own, let's see him get out of this particular predicament. But it seems to me the more the Democrats talk on these things, the kind of worse hole they dig. And that's evident in our Texas numbers, which is Democrats aren't happy with their own party right now.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, I don't have anything to add to that. I think that's right. I mean, that was the thing. I think I watched the whole speech last night, all of it, and then you get to the end, and all the networks are like, well, you see the sort of disheveled Democrats kind of walking
Right.
out as they're high-fiving each other on the side and stuff. And just somebody said, well, this is kind of a pretty indicative of the Democratic response so far, and I think you see that in those numbers.
Right.
Right.
And you mentioned the Texas Democrats. I should also, in terms of local color, the Democrats either left early or, had to kind of skulk or storm out. During Trump's exits, and that it's that scrum where everybody's kind of angling to get some acknowledgement from the president or get in the shot, et cetera. A lot of Texas Republicans prominent in that.
I saw Chip Roy a lot.
Yeah. Well, Chip,
which is interesting.
This is bitchy, and I apologize, but the Chip Roy thing, and I'm going to say this, having I acquainted with Representative Roy a little bit. If somehow this gets back to him, I don't think he'll take it too personally, but and you could tell he was trying to get in there in that camera shot and get Trump's attention, and he just couldn't do it. He kind of tapped his arm at once, I think, and somebody else was hugging up on him, and then further down, to show how it's done, Lance Gooden came in from the side on the angle, got a one-armed hug, got a little. Yeah. So if you like the semiotics of that stuff, go back and find that.
Chip is no Sheila Jackson Lee. Let's
well,
put it that
and
way.
look, Chip Roy's relationship with Trump is more probably. He has not bent the knee entirely as others have.
Yeah.
So. Speaking of bending the knee and others, we included some other national figures in here just to track some of the figures that have entered into the Trump orbit. And, in part because we've polled on some of these figures before. So we also asked for favorability ratings of J.D. Vance, Elon Musk, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and Marco Rubio. All of whom got, I think, a little love in the speech last night. Maybe not Robert. Yeah, even Robert.
He did. Oh, yeah, he did.
That was early on. I read about that, but I didn't see
came
it.
later. There's one later, too.
Yeah. But I definitely saw, the Rubio part, which was uncomfortable. But
well, he was very tired.
I think uncomfortable. If you Google Marco Rubio and uncomfortable now, you're going to get a lot of hits. What did you guys make of these numbers? Anything that really stuck out?
I mean, I think obviously we were interested in where the Musk numbers were going to go. We asked about Musk as part of a larger battery back in December before he assumed this new role, sort of is, I don't even know, co-executive or whatever. Right. And I mean, I think the interesting question would be, to my mind, I was sort of expected his numbers to shift some. And the question was, how are they going to shift? Was it going to be all Democrats or Republicans going to be upset? Because there was a lot of sort of talk about Republicans' constituents being a little bit unsure about some of these efforts. But for the most part, things have settled in a partisan way, right? So Musk saw his favorabilities drop 6 points from December to February, from 54 to 48. His unfavorables went up 11 from 30 to 41, but his attitudes among Republicans remain relatively static. About 80% have a favorable view of him. Only about 6 to 8% have an unfavorable view. Among Democrats, the share having an unfavorable view increased 24 points from 59 to 83%. Not surprising. Those with a favorable view decreased from 16 to 11. So, they kind of look like a politician's number, which I think is fine.
It's
unfortunate
for better
for him.
Or for worse, that's where he is right now.
That's where he is. I mean, unfortunately for him, he's a businessman too. So, there's probably some externalities to all this. But I mean, more than anything, it's not as though he has kind of cut through the polarization in some ways by being as disruptive as he's been. And I think that's the most interesting out of this for me. I mean, J.D. Vance clearly recovered. Republicans came around. He's at this point 48 favorable, 36 unfavorable. Again, high favorabilities among Republicans. So that was sort of what I took out. I mean, anything else you were looking at in there?
Yeah, I mean, I thought obviously, we were very interested in the Musk number, and the Musk number moved, as you say, I think in predictable directions. Some people might be disappointed there's not more negative backlash, but in the Musk numbers, I mean, his Republicans are accepting him as one of their own. Yep. His favorability ratings among Republicans, very high. Not as high as Trump, but 82 favorable is pretty good.
Yeah, 54 very favorable.
Right.
Yeah, I think that very unfavorable number did strike me. He's at 34%. Musk is 34% very unfavorable, which is almost right on top of Trump's unfavorable number. Yeah. So I think what's clearly happened is that the Democratic Party and Democratic identifiers have basically decided that he's responsible. Musk is responsible for the Trump agenda, and they don't just dislike him; they really dislike him.
Yeah, among Democrats, he jumped from 59 unfavorable in December to 83 unfavorable.
Yeah,
That's
in February. That's pretty big.
That's pretty big. Yeah, it's a pretty big jump.
Right. I would point out also that there's this interesting bump up amongst Trump and the administration. It's not totally evident in the fave numbers, although it's a little bit there. You certainly see with Vance. You don't see that in the Texas Republican numbers nearly as much.
Interesting.
And that it partly might be that we've pivoted to a policy season in Texas, and as Republicans proposed. But I think it's actually deeper than that. I think it's the nature of things that they're fighting for here, that the Texas Republicans are fighting for, are not the same thing as the nature of the things that Trump and Vance and relatedly Musk are going after. Right? The national agenda is government inefficiency, government waste, government fraud. This stuff that really resonates with populists.
Where are you going to find that in Texas?
That's an uncomfortable conversation.
Well, that's
an uncomfortable conversation when you've owned government for 25 years.
That's not really an option for the Texas Republicans. So their focus obviously is on the meat and potato things we talk about, plus things that are more controversial, school choice.
I would take it one step further, but also, if you think about the last couple, the agenda hasn't even changed.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, if you think about how static it is, I mean, one of the things, I was giving a presentation last week, and I was talking about, what to expect on economic attitudes. I'm saying, look, from what we've seen, we should expect, we're going to talk about this. National economic attitudes is obviously jumbled, right? Because of a change of the administration. We know that people view these things through a partisan lens. But when you think about Texas, it's like the opposite of an experiment, right? We shifted everything at the national level. Now we're going to see all the attitudes shift. And then here in Texas, we've kept everything the same. And it's not only the leadership, the statewide leaders, the majorities in the legislature, but even the agenda: immigration, property taxes, school vouchers. Why would we expect, sort of that positive? Because if anything, it's like we're doing the same thing. We're doing water again too.
Yeah.
Okay, got it. It's like, I mean, it's hard to imagine people getting too excited about something that they just apparently fixed 2 years ago and 4 years ago, right?
I find this really.
I do think it's interesting.
Well, that's my point is more of an observational one, which is just that it's interesting, and this is, I think, a perfect example of inductive theorizing, which is we look at the data and we say, well, geez, Trump is up, Vance is up.
We may have just renamed
right
this
direction.
podcast.
Not yet.
But you look at it and then you go, whoa. That's probably because of the things that Josh was talking about. But I do find I hadn't thought of that in a vacuum. That when you've owned the keys to the car, as Jim sort of hinted at, for a long period of time, populist messaging becomes a little problematic. So that's something to keep our eyes on, I think.
Yeah, the couple things I want to come back to on that. I mean, the state national thing I had pegged. I think I want to talk about a couple more things. I want to come back to that. The populism thing really resonates, but I did a panel yesterday with Kurt Wayland, right? So we talked a lot, about the Trump administration. We talked a lot about populism. And it was an interesting, I was just talking to somebody, I mean, the construct really wound up kind of dominating the discussion in a way that was not anticipated, even though I should have. I want to circle back to all that, but this all does touch on the economic stuff. So let's talk a little bit, it's related to Trump, and I think there's interesting connective tissue here between the state stuff, state views of the state, views of what's going on in national politics, but also the different perspectives that you're kind of getting at in the policy agenda, I think is also manifesting in this economic stuff in interesting ways with some other cross currents. So, Josh, tell us a little bit about the various economic measures we had, and then let's move through a couple of them.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, as always, we ask people to assess, sort of the quality of the national economy, the state economy, their own personal economic situation. We've also been, of late asking people to sort of to project into the future and whether they expect the economy to get better or worse. And then we've delved deeper into, what of the potential economic concerns that are out there, are the ones that are really sort of most important to them? What are the ones that they're very concerned about, extremely concerned about versus somewhat? And you see a pretty wide range of people less concerned currently about, let's say, the stability of banks and financial institutions like they might have been in 08 and 09, more concerned about prices. And I will say, I'll add a little bit more color to that from the open-endeds as we go.
Yeah.
We also ask questions specifically about the impact of tariffs, both in the short and the long term, since this is one of sort of, if not the biggest sort of economic policy kind of on offer that is almost this certain to happen in some form or fashion, if it's not already happening, I guess, now. And I just say that because we'll see what happens with the tax cuts or not.
Sure.
That's why I'm just sort of pegging that. But we asked people to sort of get a sense of their reaction to that. I think we should start there because that's actually some really interesting results as far as, I'm concerned in terms of looking at this stuff. So, we asked people, do you think basically that the U.S. increasing tariffs is going to result in higher prices for everyday goods, lower prices, or have no impact? Now, even though if you're listening to this podcast and you probably read other things, you'll know that most economists think that, or know that increasing tariffs will lead to an increase in prices. Most voters also know that. 68% of voters said it'll lead to higher prices, 7% lower prices, 12% no impact, and 13% admit they had no idea. Now, what's interesting is that when we say, do you think that the U.S. increasing tariffs will generally help the U.S. economy, hurt the U.S. economy, or have no impact to the U.S. economy in the long run, right? So not just saying, is it going to impact prices, but what's it going to do to the economy? Well, there we see 39% say it's going to help the economy in the long run, 44% say it's going to hurt the economy in the long run. So much closer. Now, if we look at Republicans, we see some pretty sophisticated attitudes, I would say. So nearly half, 48%, expect the tariffs to result in higher prices. About, a fifth, 1 in 5 say that it'll have no impact. Another 1 in 5 say that they just don't know, right? But again, the plurality, almost majority say higher prices. Now, long run, is it going to help or hurt the economy? 2/3 say it's going to help the economy in the long run. And so if you think about, the argument, that Trump was making last night about the fact that you're essentially, in some ways, we're going to build it here. This is a reorganization of the economy, and this is going to take some time. Well, that message is actually
seems to be sinking in.
It seems to be resonating. Yeah. And this is not, this is sophisticated. This is sort of surprising to find this kind of short-term, long-term thinking about this. Now, again, it's easy to say it in the abstract. If prices start going up, given what we know about the rest of the economic stuff we're going to get into, there's going to be some hard, realities.
Yeah, it's an interesting, it's very consistent, again, with the way that the Trump team has been selling this.
Yeah.
Right? You think about last night, as I understand it, one of the few improvised, he stuck unusually close to the script last night. But one of the things he did improvise towards the end, which I remember pretty clearly, was this moment where he said, "Look, it's going to be rough for a while." Yeah. I can't remember exactly what the phrasing was, but he acknowledged, this may go poorly for a bit.
Right.
Yeah. They've been selling the long-term model, as a kind of a trade regime change. Obviously, they're not using those terms, for a while. And I think you're right, Josh. It's clearly sunk in with his partisans.
Right. Now, the problem, if you will, is the fact that
it might not be right.
Well, it might not be right, and it's hitting people, where they tell us it hurts. And so, there's two pieces of this. So one, I already mentioned, there's these national economic attitudes. And what we see if we look at sort of overall, we see an improvement from last year. Most of those, the improvement in attitudes we already saw in December. Essentially, once people knew the regime was changing, it was there. So basically, throughout much of last year, about 50% of voters in Texas said that the economy is worse compared to the prior year. If we look at December of last year and this most recent poll, it's 40%, 39%. So it's about a 10-point drop. Now, not surprisingly, even in December, only 16% of Republicans said that they expected the national economy to get better. By February, it's 50%. Among Democrats, who, again, same situation, 22% said that the economy was worse compared to last year. In December, just in December, in February, it's 67% say it's worse. Now, we see this all the time. I suggest people go look at our trend graphics on sort of national economic attitudes, and you can see changes in the administration. Much more positive about the future if you're a Republican, right? So we go from 32%, we're going to have a better economy in a year, to 78%. For Democrats, the share who say it's going to be worse went from 14% to 63%. So one thing you have to say is you take all that with a grain of salt. The challenge here is that attitudes towards the Texas economy, basically static and not super great. 28% said it's better, 32% worse. That's about where we've been. Personal economic situation, 24% of people say they're better off compared to last year. 33% say they're worse off. The rest say they're in the middle, basically haven't changed. Pretty much static. And that goes to the thing, all the changes that happen at the national level don't translate through to people's lived experiences in Texas, where nothing has really changed at the political level. And economically, people's concerns, if anything, have gotten a little bit higher over time. 70% were very concerned about prices in December. 73% are very concerned today. 68% about the cost of healthcare. 60% about the cost of housing. None of these concerns just changed because the occupant in the White House changed hands, because ultimately people are still paying these things, and you can't tell them that the prices are lower.
Yeah, there's something about specificity and the immediacy of the impact in the terms of questions, and we've talked about this in here a lot. We expect partisanship to affect these macro level, particularly the national macro level assessments.
Right.
But, they're much more diluted when you give people diluted. They're much more diluted when we give people specific instances for them to think about in the economy, right?
Yeah. Let me try to be brief, but start general and then go granular, because Josh covered a lot of ground in there, from macro attitudes all the way down to how people view tariffs. At the macro level, there's an indicator that's highly, highly correlated with economic evaluations. It's the right direction or wrong track question. And the change that you get, and this is an interesting question in that people didn't automatically adjust their expectations or evaluations after the election, because you were still talking about where the country was right now. So in December of 2024, we had 56 wrong track, 31 right direction. That's minus 25. In the most recent poll, we're at 43 wrong track, 48 right direction, plus 5. That's a 30-point shift in the track question. So, and I would sort of give a shorthand to the data that Josh characterized, I think, very accurately from 2024 leading into 2025, which is when asked about kind of how things were going to be, a big chunk said they don't know, and they were waiting for the result of the election. So you couldn't get a lot of leverage on future casting in mid to late 2024. But what's pretty fascinating is that once the election happened, the numbers turned as you would expect, where Republicans said, okay, now I know that Trump's president, I'm optimistic. Not as many Democrats said, oh, Trump's elected, now I'm pessimistic. Now, that was directionally what happened, but the latter did not compensate for the former. So you've had these dramatic shifts in what I would call macro attitudes. Now, the economy is a performance issue. And that's where we are right now. The great question that I think Josh deserves credit for on here is a split sample where he asked people about, do you think we're going to see a price increase because of the tariffs? And then that was A. And then B, another half of the sample got, do you think in the long term it helps or hurts? It would have been interesting if we could have had a three-way split where we asked people, some version got, our price is going to go up. Another version got, is it going to help jobs in the United States? And then the third one, which was just long-term. How do you weigh those two things in combination? Josh is right. The people have complex attitudes on tariffs, actually a little smarter than I might have thought. I just...
Yeah, me too.
I was skeptical that people would kind of get the arguments. The Democratic argument about the price effect, I think, is a real Achilles heel for Trump right now, because it's a major part of his economic policy. And the Democrats have been messaging smartly on that. You're going to own inflation. You're going to own inflation. You're going to own prices once this kicks in. That I would argue that is maybe the only coherent message the Democrats have kind of had in the last 3 or 4 months. I think it's sort of working here.
I was going to say, so two things. I want to come back to jobs, but while you're still there, I was going to say, one thing that I noticed last night in the speech that I think is one of the areas where the Democrats are coherent but could, walk into the buzzsaw is if there's a government shutdown and if Trump is somehow successful in blaming them for it. Because he was sort of laying the groundwork for that last night. And, given, again, the sort of the ineffectual nature and the lack of unity in the Democratic response, it remains sort of a question as to whether in a cage match over who wins that battle, Democrats are just going to win because the party out of power always wins that fight. We'll see. I mean, right, a lot of things have happened, but I would say if the government does shut down and if Trump is successful at casting some or all of the blame on Democrats, the blame for inflation is going to fall right behind that. Yeah, you know why things are bad now? Because the Democrats don't want to agree on anything because they want to shut the government down. So I think that's one way he does it. One of the things you mentioned was jobs, and I want to point this out because it was something, I code all these. We've been asking more open-ended questions in the poll, at least one almost in every survey, to try to get a top-of-mind consideration. And I code them, so I have to read them all, which is interesting.
Open-ended, just for the audience's sake, is a question where we don't provide them with response options. We just say, what do you think about this?
Yeah,
and then poor Josh has to go in and characterize them in a coherent way.
Some of them are funny. Some of them are scary. They're all, they can all be interesting. But one of the things that I've noticed, I want to ask you about this in terms of the national polling, is that, the economic concern in the open-ended, at least especially in October going into the election, and even December to a large extent, it was prices. I'm like, prices, things are too expensive, got to get prices down. This was the first one where I was like, there was a lot more presence of jobs. There seemed to be a little bit more of an uptick in concern about the availability of jobs, which we hadn't seen because we were talking about, jobs are there. It's just that everything costs too much. But I am starting to see a little bit of a concern around the job market. I'm wondering if you're seeing any of that in the national
We
stuff.
have seen it a little bit in the national. And, the messaging tends to emphasize things like high paying or high quality jobs
Right.
and things like that. It is maybe not the flip side of the inflation coin, but if prices rise to a certain point and my job is limited in terms of how much compensation I'm getting, these things are related. I think it's curious that the Democrats have moved, I think, smartly to emphasizing prices now that they're no longer in power. Republicans seem to be moving towards jobs in a way that I think I'm with you, Josh, if I'm reading your suspicion right, that it could be very smart, but it needs to be kind of a broad, holistic messaging on the economy, which is why would you impose tariffs? Because you think jobs are being lost to these other countries because they have unfair advantages and things like that. It all gets back to, can Trump make the case that he's doing things that are going to help the lower and middle class?
Right.
That's the key. And prices is a huge part of that. Jobs are another part of it. But you have to render it in a way that the average voter says, like, yeah, Trump's working for me. I think a lot of the bump right now, just to kind of maybe close the circle a little bit, is we weren't getting anything out of the Biden administration on this. Nothing. And I think that's kind of the key difference right now. I mean, we will see whether Trump's messaging works, but it's with all apologies to the last president, it's better than going off to Rehoboth Beach every weekend and not saying anything on the economy and just voters just don't
Trump
think you do
manages to
anything.
golf a lot, but say a lot too.
Exactly. Yeah.
I don't see as much movement in the job numbers as you guys are seeing, at least apart from what we're, at least in the state numbers.
Now, Josh and I are canaries in the coal mine.
Yeah.
We're just
apart from what
looking
else
ahead,
the movement doesn't seem much bigger than what we saw in the other areas. To all that, I think there's nothing I sort of disagree with. Look, we're seeing general signs of economic trouble on the horizon, right? But I think, I'm still struck by the persistent rank of price concerns across the board, which we also saw in December, right? And that, when you have 73% very concerned about the price of, consumer goods, basically, up within the margin, only up 3 points from December, but, didn't go down. And December was a little optimistic, probably generally in terms of mood, which we've commented on here, but, followed in the rankings of the shares who are very or even very and somewhat concerned, it's all cost issues at the top four.
Right. Yeah, and they've all gone up significantly since before the election. Just to say that out loud. Not like, we're not saying 20 points or something because they're already high, right? But if you're looking at, concern over the cost of housing, very concerned. April it was 59, October was 55, then 58, then 60. Right. The cost of healthcare 61 back in October. Now it's 67, 68, the last two measures. And even, the concern over the cost of food in October and August of last year was below 70%, and it's been 70 or higher in the last two polls.
Well, I think we've already seen a comparison of what wins out, at least in this context, when it's a prices versus jobs fight. That was the last election.
At least in this environment, right? For sure.
But just to put a little data behind, just our intuition about, or kind of reading of the open-ended data. August last year, the percent very concerned about people who want to work being able to find jobs. 39% very concerned. 42% in December. 45% in February.
Right.
It's not you're right, Jim. It's not a huge increase, but it's trending up a
it's
little
there.
bit.
And again, there's clearly, if you read the economic news, there's an objective correlate to this, right? That's not huge, but seems like it could be building. I think in a lot of ways, this brings us back to where, you kind of went earlier, Daron, which is, how you parse out what is clearly something that, is prevalent in the national environment, prevalent in the state environment in terms of these concerns about prices, and how they play differentially at the state and national level. Because as you guys have both said, I mean, you said, the possible Achilles heel, this issue is just hanging out there. It's going to be what defines the second half of the Trump term. However long they sustain the pace and the aggressiveness they have now, if the numbers are still looking like this and the the inflation numbers have not gone down, and there's a compound effect of the tariffs that, with a lag but the lag may actually not be very long on this if they stick
according to Target. It'll be next week.
If they stick with where they are now, right? And then this is going to continue to loom large. But even though these are all Texas numbers we're talking about, there's not a lot the Texas legislature can do about prices. Even though when we ask people what they want the legislature to act on, prices, lowering prices is up there.
Right. No, I mean, I think what's really sort of fascinating in this moment, and maybe you guys react to that, just a thought. So I don't really have, it's not like a finished thing, but
inductive theorizing.
Yeah, maybe you guys can take it somewhere. But I mean, it is really interesting to watch, let's say, the Republican state officials, members of the legislature, essentially fall in line behind, wherever Trump is headed on anything for the most part. I mean, there are people who,
We have a Doge committee.
Yeah, we have a Doge committee, right? But what it is interesting is we sort of go towards tariffs, and a lot of people are like, well, Texas does, rely on trade a lot, and sort of point out, it's like our GDP is bigger than Russia, we have a lot going on here, and we're going to be affected, more than a lot of other states. And it is really interesting that essentially you have the Republican government. It's in Austin. They're meeting right now, and we're almost just kind of pretending this is not happening. I mean, it's almost like the measles outbreak, it's just like we're walking right into this thing where, and if anything, he's got members of his own party cheering him on. But what is this going to look like in 6 months?
Yeah, I mean, there's a card in the Axios local mailers this morning about, with some data on the dependence of Texas on binational trade with Mexico, which is huge.
Well, you pointed this out a lot too. We talked about this before, but it's like there's the dependence of Texas on federal funding. I mean, there's a lot of ways that Texas stands to really, be hurt by this. And I said, and because it's coming from the same party, there's not really a lot of pushback going on right now. But I think that's actually maybe we'll see. But if this does manifest in some, significantly higher prices, it's going to be a pretty rude awakening for a lot of people, right?
Yeah, I wouldn't even call this impulsive theorizing, but it's not even theorizing, but it does remind me of the second part of the Bush term. I mean, you sort of emphasized the Katrina dip, but everything seems pretty good, but then it's not.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, it can turn on you in a way that is not necessarily, that can be very surprising. Put it that way.
Yeah, uncontrollable. At a certain point.
We study politics and we study public opinion. And I think in doing that, you inevitably end up getting doses of humility as you try to figure out what's going to happen. This one has so many moving parts.
Yeah.
You're talking about maybe a deal with Russia, the energy plan that the Trump administration has, right? You got the Doge efforts going on. You've got these looming, tax cut renewals that are kind of hanging over things right now. You've got these tariffs. And I'm fascinated with economists who said, this is clearly going to do this or that. I don't think it's clearly going to do anything. I really do think there's so many things that could come together. So, back to inductive reasoning, in a year and a half, we'll probably go it was clear that if you're going to raise tax, if you're going to keep the tax cuts and have tariffs and, you're going to cut these government, that of course that was going to be inflationary. And on the other hand, it could go completely the other. Oh, they got these tariff deals, after putting a pressure to Canada and Mexico.
Right.
And this energy renewal has lowered gas prices and,
Or prices are down because we're in a recession and everybody's looking for jobs. And it's a different thing.
Exactly. And I think all of these things are on the table. And, from a political perspective, and politics are really critical here, not just for marshaling support for your program, but also communicating what you're doing to an American public that is jittery over high prices.
Yeah.
And I think it's the administration's responsibility, and then to a lesser extent in Texas, this has to be done at the state level, to communicate what are you doing? What are you doing to try to address the issues that people think are critically important? The contrast here between the economy, where it's complex and we sort of have a to-be-determined attitude, is on immigration and border security, where I think they've been very effective at communicating what they're doing. I don't even think they're doing as much.
Yeah.
I don't think it's even close.
They're certainly doing less than they promised.
Right. But I think there's, the story which is, we're tightening the border. We're strengthening the border, and we're going after people who are here. It's an easier narrative, and I think people have already, especially Republicans, have already, I'm going to say swallowed it. I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, but.
Well, I mean, I think, we haven't really talked about the immigration thing. Maybe we'll come back to it. But I mean, one I would note about the immigration thing, one thing that's interesting is that, the level of concern as, the flows at the border have gone to, drip, drip, drip compared to the intermittent floods of the last couple of years. I mean, it's just lowered the temperature on the issue. I was looking at those numbers, talking to a reporter today and, striving for the right quick.
Yeah, Republicans just moved over from
line.
Crisis to very serious, like 10 points.
Right. I think what I said to the reporter is something like, look, the numbers have cooled, but they've cooled from, a raging fire to simply still burning, right? I mean, but the MIP number at the state level for immigration and border security dipped below 50% for the first time among Republicans for the first time in a long time.
Long time.
Right. So there are signs of this kind of glimmer in the force on immigration. But, I also want to come back. I mean, I do want to press this question of, Josh kind of talked about this a minute ago, but I'm curious what you think, Daron, actually, because, lowering the costs of everyday goods and services was articulated as either an extremely or very important issue for the state legislature to prioritize.
Yeah.
81%, tied with water and just below the 84% on reliability of the state's energy grid.
Which, by the way, still going nowhere, that issue.
Yeah, right. Not in terms of not going away.
Yeah, just doesn't go away.
I would say I was going to go back and look. I think we were in the field during that cold snap, but there were no problems. But I think it doesn't underline it doesn't negate the point that it takes nothing for people to worry about the grid now.
Yeah.
Right. Only the threat of things. So I am just I'm curious. I don't know how to parse out the fact that these economic concerns, people are thinking about them globally right now because of the price thing, the cost thing in particular. That's the wording of the item was, legislature should address lowering the cost of everyday goods and services. Now, one might bark at us saying, well, they can't do that, but really nobody can. So
I think, but we have these issues all the time because we have a federal system.
Yeah.
So we're asking about, is it reasonable for pollsters to ask whether the federal government ought to do more on education? We think it is, even though we're not dumb. Well, we are dumb, but we understand that education is the province of the states, that healthcare, elections, these are all state issues where the state is the major player. But it's not unreasonable to ask about the federal government.
No, I mean, look, the federal government, Josh,
right.
Activated one of my hobby horses. I mean, look, we can say that, but the federal government pumps tons of money.
Exactly.
I mean, the state is very dependent on that money.
And I think
what all of those policy areas look like at the state level reflects huge amounts of federal support.
So from the audience point of view, to kind of draw you into our world a little bit, we've essentially decided that it's reasonable to ask about the federal government's performance or how big a priority the federal government ought to make certain issues, even though those issues are certainly constitutionally kind of the province of the states, at least primarily. This is what you're talking about, Jim and Josh, is an area in which the national government is the prime mover, and that is macroeconomic policy, tariffs that have an impact on people's finances. But I would say it's still legitimate, as we ask about state issues to the national government, to ask national issues to the state government.
Yeah.
But I would also concede that the toolkit that the Texas legislature has to affect these things is quite limited, especially compared to the national government's toolkit on state issues.
Sure.
And so that makes it a kind of an interesting question about, how much do we make of the fact that Texans say prices are a huge issue, and because of that, would we say, boy, the Republicans are in trouble because the legislative agenda doesn't really have a whole lot?
Yeah, I mean,
on that.
and look, whether it's fair or not doesn't matter to the voters.
Exactly. Yeah.
I mean, ask Joe Biden.
Yeah. Well,
right?
I think this is something
in terms of economy.
Yeah, this is something we've talked about. Looking ahead to state elections and the political dynamics and conversation that occurred in the state of Texas. The main issue that voters have on their minds, immigration is one, but it's the economy, it's prices, et cetera. If this is a disastrous policy, if there's a recession or if prices go up, let alone stay as high as they are, the Republicans are not just in trouble nationally, they're in trouble in Texas.
Right, or they're under more pressure certainly than they're used to.
Exactly. I don't mean
used to feeling from the outside. Right.
Exactly.
I mean, they've been causing themselves a lot of trouble in the last election cycle. But
right, and this stuff, if it happens early enough, compounds, which is Democratic donors and volunteers and activists get energized and maybe field candidates and contest races at the state house level that they might otherwise have taken a pass on. And this is why there was some kind of hushed conversations in Texas about how much do they really want Trump to win? How much do state Republicans really want Trump to win in 2024? Because his victory means the Republicans own everything. And
when you're following whatever.
Well, you're at you're at Trump. If there's anything state Republicans should know, like every other Republican in the country, you are at Donald Trump's mercy.
Yeah.
Right now, in terms of what they decide to do, let's go to our dealer's choice session. We were going to, we'll come back and talk about more of these results in future podcasts. So, curious, as we always do, what'd you guys pull out of this? What that we haven't talked about much, or that we have talked about, you think is we've not given enough importance to? What stood out in the poll? Josh, let's start with you.
Yeah, one of the things I really enjoy about working on this project and having worked on it for so long is the fact that we get to go back to the well, which doesn't just mean that we get to do less work because we don't have to write a new question, but we get to look at these results along another dimension. So you can look at the results within to see the differences by partisanship, but by looking at it over time, you get this other, sort of way to sort of interpret the results, and sometimes it gives you something that, is totally makes sense. And sometimes you say, oh, that's interesting. And that's the stuff that I really love. So one of those is this, which is that we asked this question in November of 2015, so a little less than 10 years ago. And again today, in the February poll, we said, as you may know, the 14th Amendment to the Constitution states that all children born in the United States are automatically U.S. citizens regardless of their parents' legal status. Would you favor, of course, changing the Constitution to repeal this part of the 14th Amendment? So we basically asked about, how about removing birthright citizenship, which has been proposed and sort of rejected, at least by the courts? Decreed and rejected by the courts. But we've asked about this. We asked about 10 years ago. And 10 years ago, 48% of voters favored repealing basically birthright citizenship. 39% were opposed to this. 13% had no opinion. Asking this question again, I had thought if I had to bet, it would have gone up. But in fact, the opposite. It went down. Today, 36% said they favored repealing this part of the 14th Amendment. 48% oppose repealing this part of the 14th Amendment, so they flipped. And what you're seeing is just, again, sort of a couple of things here. Republicans did not move a lot. You saw, again, more Democrats in opposition to repealing, but you also see more opposition from Hispanics, more opposition from African Americans. So in some ways, what actually I think has happened is that these sorts of issues have become more the fodder of public discussion as opposed to kind of I would almost say fringy discussions. Yeah. People have come to, basically make evaluations of it based on their own experiences, their own politics, whatever.
A more immediate reality of the question.
But the interesting thing is the state actually kind of liberalized on this question over the last 10 years, which I think is pretty fascanating given the broader context we're discussing.
What it tells me is we're going to have to ask it again.
Yeah,
right.
Probably.
In a couple of months, probably.
Probably. You can't make a trend with two.
How about you, Daron?
There were two broad questions that caught my attention. And I'll leave one, but just I will point it out. We asked about a list of concerns and priorities for K through 12 education and the dominance of school safety. Other concerns came up: curriculum reform, teacher pay, et cetera. Always very, very highly rated. But man, school safety was just above and beyond. So that was my runner-up.
That's been a fairly consistent feature of this battery
since at least Uvalde.
Since Uvalde.
Yeah, exactly. And by the way, that jibes with data I've seen on Hispanic samples. It's just a huge priority. Again, since Uvalde, and actually a little earlier. But I'm going to go with a vaunted Q31 for those of you playing along at home. We asked about, do each of the following state taxes have a major minor or no impact on your personal finances. And we asked this just a couple years ago. So this is the last ledge session, February 2023. And
it's almost like we did that on purpose.
I know. It's almost like some foresight.
It's nuts.
And what was fascinating is that the percentage of the Texas electorate, voting public, that said these taxes had a major impact on their personal finances jumped by about 10 percentage points across the board. So sales tax, last time around, 41% said major impact, 51 this time.
That's probably going to be attached to inflation, right? Also,
I think so.
Well,
I think so.
Anyway. Let's go through the rest.
Although inflation was a big, was a big deal at the, maybe
yeah.
a bigger deal at the time. But 58% said the property tax had a major impact in 23, 68 this time.
That's
right?
amazing.
So, and other taxes, the business tax went from 20 major to 25 this time. Almost nothing. The excise taxes on alcohol and tobacco didn't move much. But a 10-point jump of people saying, and we know,
and these are the high impact tax. I mean,
exactly. So I think
high incidence taxes.
And I know Jim wants to talk about this because we spoke briefly. He said, like, what do you got? And I mentioned this. He goes, that was mine. So I'm interested in what Jim's.
Well, I mean, look, it was more, podcast host than inductive theorizing. But I mean, when I look at this, to me, this is one of the answers to the how do we think about where national conditions and national politics and all these concerns and prices, I think it makes sense to see this, at least provisionally as part and parcel of these concerns about prices. If you're watching prices and you're watching your expenditures, you're going to be more sensitive to tax expenditures, which are big. So if you're going to the supermarket, it's likely that when you go, oh man, these eggs or whatever eggs are, these eggs are expensive. And this, what I hear from people all the time, this bag of groceries costs me twice as much. Mm-hmm. Well, you're paying almost twice as much or a big proportion higher in sales tax too. So it makes sense to me that people are going to notice this and be more sensitive to it. And to me, it's part of the follow-up to our notion that, look, on one hand, elected officials only have so much impact over this stuff, even at the federal level, and yet it finds its way into the political bloodstream.
I think this is like one of the great results of this survey. And part of it is the time thing. And I'll just say why. And it really ties together everything we've been talking about here, right? Voters are concerned about the economy. They're concerned about the prices. We ask them what the legislature should do. A large share of them say they should be focusing on the economy. However, we've got to, this is Texas, right? This is a low taxes, low services state. Mm-hmm. So on the one hand, there is no ideological fuel to, like, let's say, have the government go out and do a bunch of stuff. That's just not in the bloodstream here, to use that again. On the other side, if you want to believe that, like, well, it's government spending that's led to this price increase, well, again, Texas can't really draw back a bunch of spending because we don't spend that much on a bunch of, stuff outside of the things we spend money on. So what does that solution look like? Well, it looks like property tax reduction, right? We're gonna hit you at the bottom line. We're gonna deal with both your housing and your issue about cost, prices, whatever. But here's the issue: they've been doing it, and people actually still think it's a problem. In fact, it's gone up.
Yeah.
Even though they've been making efforts at this repeatedly over the last really decade to bring the property taxes down. Yeah. And we've talked about this all the time. It just has to do with the fact that, all kinds of things. It's another podcast, but talking about
I was about to
all the drivers.
all the drivers.
The rate has increased, but the absolute value that people are
appraisals and
and the thing is, this can break both ways. And this is just to be fair again about which we don't know, because look, if the economy goes in a negative direction and housing values go down, well, all of a sudden people are going to get an even bigger tax cut on their property taxes, and the legislators will say, hey, we did that for you.
Right.
Now your house is worth less. I guess people make that trade-off.
Right.
But I think this is the whole point. It's not a straight line from, let's say, increasing the value of the homestead exemption to a voter saying, hey, I've got more money in my pocket, and the legislature really addressed my concerns.
Thanks, guys. And we've asked whether people felt it, and they don't. And look, they're aware of this. I mean, the lieutenant governor has been
they're aware of this.
Very explicit in wanting to drive as large a property tax reduction to as broad a base as he possibly can.
Yep.
Yeah, and the data here, I mean, look, we're talking about 68%, almost 7 in 10, said property tax has a major impact on their personal finances. And, if you look at the question we asked about the Texas Leg's actions on this, you're getting 60% who said that the Texas legislature efforts on this had some impact on their personal finances. 25%, 1 in 4, said a major impact. So,
That's an interesting way of reading those numbers.
Yeah,
I mean, I often read them the other way. But
I know.
That makes sense.
I did too, but
that's
then
a smart way to do that, I think.
Yeah, and I think Republicans would look at that, and you're right. They're not done with this
Well,
issue,
and I would also say even beyond that, Democrats look at that.
Yeah.
Democrats are not standing up in the Texas legislature by and large to lead the fight against property tax relief and do something else.
Yeah, and I looked at this recently from the last set of polling on this, and and as popular as reducing, or important as much importance as Republicans place on reducing property taxes for the legislature, Democrats also would like to see the legislature reduce property taxes.
Yeah. Well, because look, you don't get a sales tax bill at the end of the year.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Incrementalism of that is, I think, important. So what did I arrive at? Since Daron shameless, no, I gave it to Daron, but I gave it up because I'm such a generous colleague.
You're a surrender monkey. So.
I'm a surrender monkey, exactly. The other thing that I'm going to pull out of here then is something that I've been talking. I've kind of raised this with a couple of groups I've talked to lately. I think I brought it up in here in the last poll, but also the degree to which healthcare and health expenses are lurking in people's sense of concerns. We've seen it. Josh and I did a project for limited for some business folks. Loomed very large in that survey that we did last year. But in this, and there's in the same couple of places, right? Healthcare ranked high, and the healthcare costs ranked high on the list of economic concerns. And doing something about availability of healthcare, access to healthcare, was also pretty high in the legislative concerns at the state level. So we're seeing that out there, and it feels to me like, on one hand, healthcare is always kind of out there. Since the ACA, it hasn't broken through. But I kind of, it's a spidey sense thing, maybe based with some, this is definitely inductive prediction. But it does feel like there's something out there that is kind of it's multiple points of contact. It's cost, it's accessibility, it's insurance, it's prescriptions. It's all of these things that people are kind of going, this is really expensive and not working very well.
I was saying it's performance of the system, right? I mean, even if you do have good coverage, nobody really says, boy, that was really easy and, great and clear, right? The other thing I'll point out, that's interesting, I think, in this is just, for people who are interested in this topic, is if you look back, as I was looking back at this recently, because we have a lot of healthcare polling, especially during the efforts of the last Trump administration to repeal the ACA and sort of looking at, people's senses of the alternatives and all these things. This is not to say that, I think Republicans are open for a universal healthcare system. But when you do ask questions about alternatives to the current system, and you do ask questions about, potential universal systems, it's surprising how split Republican attitudes have become on a lot of that stuff, at least what I've seen. I don't know if that's what you've seen, where, you're not going to see, 75, 80% of Republicans saying, nope, this employer-based insurance system is great. It's just not what you see. Now, it doesn't mean that they're saying like, hey, let's expand Obamacare. Let's, that's not what that's saying. But the frustration with the system is just kind of everywhere.
Yeah.
There's a bipartisan consensus that the system is broken.
Yeah.
And I think that's right. The same way you mentioned that Democrats aren't up screaming, to raise property taxes, Republicans aren't exactly leaping to the defense of the healthcare system right now.
Yeah.
Right.
So that was my thing. I think it's, I keep seeing that, and it's just kind of risen to the point that, is somebody going to do something with this?
It's risen a little bit above the norm. I mean, you said, there's always a certain floor of attention to healthcare, and that's because there's people who are chronically ill and for whom, the system is just a nightmare, right? And but it's a little bit above that floor. It's been ticking up.
I think that's right. So with that, Daron, thanks for coming in.
My pleasure, Jim.
I hope your week gets better.
Yeah. It's on the upswing already.
I think you did a great job in here.
Thank you, man.
Attaboy.
Thank you, man. I'm feeling seen.
Good. Well, perfect.
Josh, as always, thanks for all the work prepping us for this and doing the lifting here. Thanks, as always, to our esteemed colleagues here in the audio studio, in the dev studio in LAITS and the College of Liberal Arts at UT Austin. Most of all, thanks to you for listening. The polling we're talking about today, all findable at our newly refreshed and more accessible website, texaspolitics.utexas.edu. Go check that out. You can download, everything related to this poll, results, crosstabs, thousands of free to download and now easier to find graphics. You can use our search engine to look for specific results. You can check out our latest poll page. You can check out our blog that will have that has an extensive write-up of these results and more. So with that, Thanks for listening, and we will see you next week on the next episode of Inductive Theorizing. The Second Reading Podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.